I'm sick of people saying, oh, you'll find someone. It had been nearly 2 years since the breakup, but the sting of it hadn't fully faded. It wasn't just the end of the relationship that hurt, it was the aftermath, the constant well-meaning but exhausting comments from everyone around her. People who thought they knew better than she did what she needed, offering advice and condolences as if they could somehow heal the rock that still gnawed at her heart. You'll find someone, they would say, over and over, as if it were some magic phrase that would instantly mend the pieces of her broken heart. As if it were that simple. At first, she smiled and nodded, the words like a dull buzz in the background of her life. She had heard them so many times that she could almost predict them before they were even spoken. Friends, family, co-workers, they all had the same tired line, as if the answer to her sadness could only be found in someone else, as if the only way to be whole again was to fill the empty space with a new person, a new relationship, a new partner who would somehow erase everything that had come before. But every time those words were uttered, she felt a rising frustration building inside her, like a pressure she couldn't release. She didn't want to hear it anymore. She didn't want to be told that she just had to wait for someone else to make everything better. It wasn't just about finding someone, it was about finding herself again. She had lost so much of herself in the relationship, in trying to make it work, in bending herself to fit a mold that was never meant for her. And now, the idea that the solution to her problems was another person felt like an insult. The truth was, she wasn't ready to find someone. She wasn't even sure she wanted to. The last few years had drained her. She had given so much of herself to her ex, compromising her own needs, her own desires, her own identity, that now all she could think about was how to rebuild. She needed space to breathe, to rediscover what made her feel alive again, without the pressure of someone else's expectations, without the weight of someone else's hopes for the future that didn't align with her own. She spent her days in a blur of monotony, working long hours, avoiding her phone when she knew she'd be met with yet another "you'll find someone" text or message. Her friends tried to be supportive, but even their kindness felt suffocating at times. They didn't understand. They didn't understand that she wasn't just mourning the loss of a relationship, but the loss of herself, of her own sense of purpose. And hearing their insistence that she needed to move on, find someone new, get back out there, just made her feel like she was failing to live up to some unwritten rule that people were desperately trying to impose on her. And then there were the moments when her mother would pull her aside, her voice filled with concern, trying to assure her that time heals all wounds. But time wasn't enough. Time wasn't going to fix the hole in her heart, or the emptiness that still echoed in the space where her dreams and hopes used to be. Time didn't tell her how to navigate the complex mess of emotions that had been stirred up in the wake of her broken marriage. Time didn't tell her how to become whole again. She would sit in her apartment, staring out the window as the world moved around her. The city streets, full of people rushing from one place to the next, seemed so far removed from her own stillness. She had no desire to chase after someone new. She had no interest in dating apps or awkward first dates. The idea of opening herself up to someone else, when she hadn't even figured out how to love herself again, felt overwhelming. It wasn't that she didn't want to love again, or that she didn't believe in love. It was just that she needed time. She needed time to find peace within herself before she could share that peace with another person. But no one seemed to understand that. Everyone seemed to think that the solution to her loneliness, her hurt, was to replace the person who had left her with a new face, a new touch, a new promise of forever. The pressure was suffocating. Each time she was met with another "you'll find someone," it felt like the weight of the world was being placed on her shoulders. Like her worth could only be defined by the presence of someone else in her life. Like she was incomplete without a partner. But the truth was, she was learning to be okay on her own. Slowly, she was discovering what it meant to be enough without the validation of another person. She was learning to find happiness in the small things, the quiet moments of solitude, the pleasure of a good book, the freedom of doing whatever she wanted without worrying about anyone else's needs. She was learning to rebuild her sense of identity, to embrace the person she was without the need for anyone to complete her. It wasn't easy, and some Days were harder than others. There were still moments when the loneliness crept in, when the memories of her past relationship would flood her mind, and when she'd feel the pang of longing for something more. But those moments were becoming less frequent. And when they did come, she reminded herself that it was okay to feel lost sometimes. It was okay to take her time. She wasn't in a race. She didn't need to find someone. Not yet. Not until she was whole again. It was a slow, quiet process, one that no one else could see or understand. But in the solitude, she was finding her way back to herself, piece by piece. And maybe, just maybe, that was all she really needed. As the months wore on, the pressure to move on started to loosen, though it was a struggle at times. Her life was no longer defined by the expectation that someone else would come along to fix what was broken. Instead, she found herself embracing the solitude, not as a void to be filled but as a space to grow. There were still days when the loneliness hit her like a wave, crashing with an intensity that threatened to drown her. On those days, she allowed herself to feel it, to sit with the sadness, and then gently pull herself back together. It wasn't just the loneliness that weighed on her. It was the constant reminders from the world around her that told her she was supposed to be seeking out something or someone. The comments kept coming, like a dull, persistent hum. Friends asked if she was dating yet. Family members subtly pointed out the people they thought might be a good match for her. It wasn't malicious, it was just their way of showing concern, of wanting to see her move on, but their concern felt more like an intrusion into the life she was slowly rebuilding, piece by piece. Each time she heard the same tired refrain, "You'll find someone," it became harder to ignore. The words weren't coming from a place of love anymore. They felt like a demand, a sign that she wasn't allowed to just be. It was as if they couldn't understand that she didn't need someone else to make her life complete. She needed time to heal, to rediscover the things she loved about herself before she could share that with anyone else. But despite her best efforts to ignore the comments and assert her independence, there were days when doubt crept in. She wondered if something was wrong with her for not feeling ready to move on. Was there something broken about her, something that made her unworthy of love? She would catch herself scrolling through social media, seeing people moving on, finding new relationships, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, of inadequacy. Why hadn't she been able to just get over it like everyone else seemed to? It was on these darker days that she realized something important. Healing wasn't linear, and it wasn't something to be compared or measured against anyone else's timeline. Everyone moved through life at their own pace, and just because others had found their way to new relationships didn't mean that she was somehow behind. She was moving at her own pace, one that suited her healing process, and that was okay. She began to shift her focus inward, letting go of the expectations that had been placed on her. She took up new hobbies, something she had put off for years because she was too busy trying to make everyone else happy. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. The feel of the brush on the canvas was liberating, a way to pour out emotions she hadn't been able to express in words. The colors, the swirls, the strokes of her paintbrush became her personal language of release, a way to communicate with herself in a way that words never could. Her life was no longer filled with questions of when will you find someone, or who's next. Instead, it was filled with moments of discovery. She learned to enjoy her own company, the quiet dinners she now savored with a glass of wine and a good book, the late-night walks where she could clear her head and let the world breathe with her. There were still moments of uncertainty, where the silence in the apartment felt deafening, but she was learning to embrace it as a part of her journey, not as something to fear. The more she accepted that it was okay to be on her own, the more she felt the weight of others' expectations begin to lift. Slowly, she started to understand that she didn't need anyone to validate her worth, that she could be complete on her own. The idea of finding someone no longer felt like a goal to be chased, but something that would come in its own time, when she was truly ready, not just for the sake of companionship, but because she had learned to love herself fully first. With time, she began to feel lighter. Her sadness wasn't gone, but it no longer defined her. It had become just one part of her story, a part she had learned to understand and accept. There were still days when she missed the connection, the intimacy of a relationship, but she no longer felt desperate for it. She knew now that love was something that had to come naturally, something that had to grow from a place of self-assurance and balance. She had to be whole before she could truly give herself to someone else. She had stopped searching for answers and started living in the present. She had stopped waiting for her life to follow the narrative that everyone else seemed to have written for her. The pressure to find someone faded away, and with it, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. And then one day, when she least expected it, she looked up and realized she had finally found someone, not someone new, but herself. She had rediscovered the woman she had been before the relationship. The woman she had forgotten was there, buried beneath layers of expectations and heartache. That woman, strong and capable, had been there all along, waiting patiently to come back to life. She was no longer defined by the past or the hurt, and she no longer needed the approval of others to feel validated. In that moment, she understood that it was not about finding someone else. It was about rediscovering who she was, alone, whole, and free. And that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, she continued to grow into herself, a journey that was sometimes difficult, often lonely, but ultimately liberating. She no longer felt the need to constantly seek validation from the world around her. Her mind began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. She no longer woke up to the overwhelming sense of loss that had once consumed her. Instead, she woke up to a quiet, calm assurance that she was enough. The friends who had once pressured her to get back out there began to notice the change in her. They saw how she had stopped seeking approval, how her life had become less about who was beside her and more about who she had become. They stopped asking her about potential partners, and instead started asking how she was feeling. They saw her thriving in a way they hadn't seen before, unencumbered by anyone's expectations but her own. She wasn't a project to be fixed, she was simply a woman learning to embrace life on her own terms. Her social life became more fulfilling, but in a different way. It was less about the constant need for new connections or romantic distractions. She found herself forging deeper friendships, ones that didn't come with the pressure of fitting into someone else's vision of her life. She went on solo trips, explored new places, and started to see the world not as a place she had to hurry through, but as a place to enjoy at her own pace. There were moments when she still questioned her decision to be single. When she saw couples enjoying quiet dinners, or heard about new relationships blossoming, a small part of her wondered if she had made the right choice in focusing on herself for so long. But then she would remember how far she'd come, how much she had rediscovered about her own strength, her own dreams, her own sense of purpose. She thought about the old version of herself, the one who had been desperate to be loved by someone else, to fill a void with a relationship. She could hardly recognize her now. She had stopped measuring her life by the milestones others had set for her. She had stopped wondering if she was missing out. The truth was, she wasn't missing anything. She was living, fully and authentically, in the way that worked best for her. And then one evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the sunset, a thought crossed her mind that she hadn't considered in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there for her. But this time, the thought didn't come with desperation. It didn't come with a feeling of need, but of curiosity. If it happened, it would happen naturally, without pressure, without expectations. She was open to the possibility, but she no longer defined herself by it. She was no longer the person who needed someone to complete her. She had completed herself. And in doing so, she had found a level of contentment that no one else could have given her. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer ruled her life. It had become part of her story, woven into the fabric of who she was, but it didn't have the power to dictate her future. In this newfound peace, she realized that life wasn't about rushing toward the next thing. It wasn't about fulfilling society's expectations or meeting the timelines that others had set. It was about embracing the present moment, about finding joy in the simple things, about rediscovering who she was and what she wanted, on her own terms. And so, as the months went by, she continued to live her life not in the shadow of a past relationship, but in the full light of her own personal journey. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was worthy. She knew it now, deep down, and as the seasons changed, so did she, growing, evolving, but always learning to love herself more deeply than she ever had before. And that was the most important love of all. As the seasons shifted, so did her inner world. The once overwhelming quiet of her life now felt more like a sanctuary, a place where she could breathe, where the noise of outside expectations faded into the background. She had built a life that was entirely her own, and for the first time in years, it felt like it had meaning. The loneliness she had once feared began to transform into a powerful sense of independence. She realized that the emptiness she had initially perceived wasn't really emptiness at all. It was space for growth, space for peace, and space to simply be. She started to reconnect with passions that had long been neglected. What had once been fleeting hobbies were now deep-seated interests. She began to take yoga classes, something she had always wanted to try, and found that it gave her not only physical strength but mental clarity. Each session grounded her more in herself, reminding her of the power and resilience she carried within. She joined a local book club, rediscovering her love for reading. The stories she read felt like old friends, offering her both comfort and wisdom, and, in a way, a mirror to her own personal journey. It felt like she was constantly learning, not just from the pages of books, but from the quiet, reflective moments she was now able to carve out for herself. She also started to realize how much she had underestimated the power of solitude. Before, solitude had seemed like a void to be feared, a sign that something was wrong. But now, she saw it for what it truly was: freedom. She could do what she wanted, when she wanted, without consulting anyone, without compromising. Every choice was hers, and with that came an immense sense of power. She didn't need anyone to fill her life, she was content with herself. One afternoon, while sitting at her favorite cafe with a journal in her hand, she realized something profound. Her thoughts no longer revolved around a past that had caused her pain, nor did they race toward the future, questioning when love might appear. She was simply present, in that moment, surrounded by the hum of quiet conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. She was at peace with her own company. The judgment she once felt from others was nothing more than a shadow now. She had learned that the most important relationship was the one she had with herself, and it was the one that had been worth rebuilding all along. Her friends noticed the change too. The more she embraced her own journey, the more she became a source of inspiration for them. She didn't have all the answers, but she had the wisdom to be comfortable with uncertainty. They began to see that her life didn't need to follow a traditional narrative for it to be fulfilling. She wasn't living in the shoulds anymore, she was living in the what is, and it was beautiful. Every now and then, the thought of a partner would cross her mind, but it no longer carried the weight it once did. It wasn't something she needed to seek out, or something she believed would magically fix all the pieces of her life. Instead, she felt more open to the idea of a relationship, not because it was something to complete her, but because it could be an extension of the fullness she already felt. But for now, she didn't feel that hunger, that emptiness she had once tried to fill with someone else. It wasn't always easy. There were still difficult days, where the old fears would creep in, the fear that maybe she would always be alone, that she would never find someone to share her life with. But these thoughts were quieter now, less persistent. She had learned to sit with them, to acknowledge them, and then to let them go. They no longer defined her. She didn't need anyone's approval or anyone's presence to know that she was worthy. She was her own companion, and she had learned to trust herself completely. In time, she started to view her past relationships through a different lens. The love she had once sought from others, whether from a partner or family, was a love that she had never fully extended to herself. The failed relationships, the heartache, had all been part of a process that had led her here, to this place of understanding, of acceptance, of deep self-love. She now understood that the love she had been searching for had always been within her reach. It wasn't something that could be found outside herself, it was something she could create and nurture from within. One evening, as she stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair after a long day, she looked at herself and felt something she had never felt before, genuine love for who she was. There were no more comparisons to others, no more wondering if she was enough. She was enough. The past no longer had the power to dictate her future. The weight of the world had fallen off her shoulders, and she was finally free to live life on her own terms. And just like that, she found peace. Not because the world around her was perfect, but because she had learned to find contentment in her own heart. She had learned that happiness didn't depend on the approval or love of others. She had learned that happiness was something that came from within, from the quiet, gentle acceptance of who she was, whole, complete, and undeniably worthy. With each passing day, she continued to walk her path, steady and sure, her heart open to whatever the future might hold. But for now, she was content to simply be, knowing that the greatest love she had ever needed was the one she had always had for herself, and that, she realized, was enough.